You pressed play, but something else might be listening too. Can I ask you something? Where are you right now? And what time is it there? Tell me in the comments. Just don't listen too closely. Some things hear it when you do. It had begun with silence. Not the kind that was peaceful, but the kind that settled heavily on the skin. Thick, deliberate, and oddly electric. The kind that came before something dreadful. In the sterile white corridors of the institution, that silence had become a presence of its own, humming behind fluorescent lights and between steel doors that never quite closed gently. He had been called Oliver, not by choice. The name had been given to him upon intake, scribbled hastily on forms with numbers and codes, a convenience for classification. Names weren't important to him. Words weren't, flesh and bone were. His eyes had always been still, cold like glass left too long in the winter. No emotion passed through them, no kindness lingered in his smile. He had been housed in the northeast wing, fourth level down, away from the general population, not because he posed an immediate danger, yet, but because something in him had disturbed the order. He had been watched. Every word he wrote had been reviewed, every sketch examined, and still, no one had known what was coming. Oliver had not screamed when he arrived. Others had. Most did, but he had walked in quietly, his hands unshackled, though they should have been. He had sat calmly, observed, never flinched, never blinked too much. He had answered questions only when asked, and never with more than necessary. But it was what he had written that drew attention. Long passages of detached observations, diagrams of anatomy drawn with surgeon-level precision, lists of names, lists of measurements, lists of dates, and in one corner of his journal, a single sentence, written again and again in tiny trembling strokes. I want to try it. At first it had been dismissed. Ramblings, a cry for attention, a disturbed fantasy at best. But the tone had shifted. Something cold had begun to rise from the pages like smoke. Disgust for others, disdain for life, an obsession with hierarchy that twisted natural instinct into doctrine. A belief had formed, not of superiority born from intellect or ideology, but from something more primal, something physical. A claim of dominance not through power, but through hunger. He had written of consumption, not metaphor, not madness. Actual flesh, actual blood. He had not claimed to be a predator. He had claimed to be the predator. They had moved him to isolation after that. Visits had been limited. Communication had been reduced. The medical team had requested scans. Brain patterns had been studied. The reports had been inconclusive, but something had changed in him. His posture had shifted, more relaxed, more amused. His gaze had grown heavier, as though he no longer saw those around him as people, but as prey. And still, he had waited. It had been during his third week that the first incident occurred. A nurse had gone missing. Her badge had been found near the waste chute. Blood had stained the floor near the service corridor, but no footage had shown her leaving. Oliver had smiled that day, only once, and though nothing had been proven, though he had never left his room, every staff member had begun to walk faster in the hallway. Every door had started to close just a little more tightly. He had become the storm inside the walls. At night, whispers had echoed between the vents. Other patients had heard things. Breathing, scraping, something dragging across metal, but when investigated, nothing had been found. Only Oliver, seated cross-legged on the floor of his room, eyes fixed on the far wall, as though listening to something others could not hear, and in his hand, always, the same sentence scribbled again. I want to try it. The walls had been reinforced, not officially, not in the schematics. But after the second incident, Security had been tightened. Another attendant. Gone. No witnesses. No alert raised. Only a single shoe left near the elevator shaft, and a trail of wet smudges leading to nowhere. Oliver had not moved from his cell during the time it occurred. The logs had confirmed it, and yet, something about the stillness in his expression had suggested otherwise. Something had shifted behind his eyes, subtly, disturbingly, as if something had been fed. The reports had grown more erratic. Doctors wrote of an intellectual clarity, inconsistent with his behavior. Others noted an eerie emotional absence, a void masked as control. But one phrase had been repeated more than once. He is studying us. The way he watched during interviews, measured unblinking. The way he mimicked speech patterns, mirrored gestures. The way he took note of others' vulnerabilities, like an engineer dismantling a machine. He had not merely been observing. He had been cataloging. His journal had become more detailed. No longer just musings or mantras, but evaluations, specimens, notes on musculature, on scent, on how voices changed under fear. He had begun ranking those around him, a hierarchy drawn in ink. At the top, a name only he used, the apex. Beneath it, lists of staff and patients. Crossed out names had appeared beside missing persons. He had not written these in anger. He had written them with reverence, like a ritual, like preparation. Then the drawings had begun. Not abstract, not grotesque, precise, detailed illustrations of people, staff members, fellow patients, with small annotations beside each one. Soft spine, weak jawline, and then below them images of human bodies cut open, bones separated, flesh skinned and preserved, diagrams that should have belonged to surgeons or forensic examiners, not a young man confined for psychological evaluation. And yet, every rendering had been anatomically correct, too correct, as if drawn from memory, not imagination. An emergency meeting had been held, options had been discussed: transfer, sedation, permanent detainment in a state facility underground. But no decision had been made in time, because that night, Oliver had vanished. His cell had been sealed. No signs of forced exit, no broken vents, no shattered locks, only a smear of blood on the inside of the reinforced glass, and written on the wall in neat, careful script: "You made yourselves livestock." The search had lasted days. Sniffer dogs, heat scans, every level of the compound torn apart. No trace, no body, no explanation, only silence and whispers. Some claimed he had never been human. Others believed he had never truly been confined. But most refused to speak of him at all, because since that night, doors had begun to creak open on their own. Security footage had shown flashes, frames of a figure just out of focus, and deep in the lower levels, fresh markings had been found etched into metal, carved with something far sharper than any tool. Symbols, teeth, numbers. Security had shifted. Guards began quitting. Others transferred without notice. Some simply stopped showing up. Those who remained moved in pairs. Radios crackled more often. Flashlights flickered when passing certain corridors. Always the same ones. The northeast wing had been unofficially closed. No one entered. No one cleaned. No one asked why. And yet, noises were still heard. A low hum like breathing through the walls. Footsteps in stairwells long since locked. Scratching slow, deliberate, just beyond the reach of light. When cameras were checked, the footage always glitched. Pixels melted. Time skipped. Audio distorted. But once for a few frames, something had appeared. A figure, leaning close to the lens. Pale eyes wide. Expression still. Teeth visible. Not in a smile but in observation. As if he had been waiting to be seen. Elsewhere, disappearances increased. 3 orderlies gone in 1 week. No messages. No remains. A janitor's hand was found beneath a supply shelf, still clutching a broken mop. The director filed for external intervention. No one responded. The institution remained sealed. Funding mysteriously paused. It was as though the outside world had been told to forget. And within those forgotten walls, Oliver's presence grew. One night, a doctor left a voice memo on a personal recorder. He's not a patient. He's not mentally ill. He's a prototype, a concept, something built or born to dissect us, piece by piece. The doctor never arrived home. His body was never found, but his badge had been discovered in the old morgue. Its edges were warped, melted, like it had been inside something hot or alive. Rumors began to twist into belief. Staff spoke in low tones about the one who watches. Others began seeing reflections that didn't match. They'd look into mirrors only to find themselves smiling when they weren't. One nurse claimed her reflection had blinked after she had already turned away. She resigned the next day, refusing to speak another word. And in the northeast wing, behind the door that now refused to stay locked, strange shapes were drawn on the walls, in charcoal, in blood. Sometimes new messages appeared. Food must be earned. The herd thins itself. I want to try it. Only one person dared enter that wing again. A young tech, newly hired, unaware of the warnings. He had laughed at the stories, called them fiction. He had been sent to reroute power cables. He had been seen entering the corridor at 2:46 a.m. By 2:58, the lights had gone out. By 3:10, static filled every radio frequency. By 3:25, his screams had been heard through the vents. By dawn, there had been silence again. Only his tool belt had remained, placed neatly outside the security room, and inside it, his name tag, with something scratched into its back. You tasted like fear. The facility had become a shell. Hallways once filled with routine, now echoed with absence. Schedules were no longer kept. Protocols no longer followed. The northeast wing had consumed the others like a spreading disease. Entire sectors had been sealed. Some staff refused to leave their rooms. Others left in the middle of the night and never returned, either to the facility or the world outside. Whispers spread through the ranks of those who remained. Some claimed to have seen him, moving between shadows, barefoot and silent. Others reported their names, being whispered from vents, late at night, always in their own voices. The name Oliver was no longer spoken. Only one title remained, carved in trembling script across the nurse's logbook, now stained and shredded. The apex. In time, the outside world did come, not with answers, but with erasure. A fire, they said, an electrical failure that engulfed the sublevels. No survivors reported, no bodies recovered, no real investigation conducted. The site was sealed, declared unstable, forgotten, but something still waits beneath the charred foundation. At night, in nearby towns, children whisper of pale figures glimpsed near puddles. Mirrors sometimes fog without reason, and strange symbols have appeared in the underpass tunnels, drawn in ash, in something darker, harder to identify. Those who find them feel watched. Dreams begin to twist. Some stop eating. Some begin carving their own reflections. A private security tape, recovered from a storage unit miles away, shows the last known footage of the institution's interior. There is no sound, only a long corridor, empty. Then a shape, barely visible, a man. No, something once shaped like a man. He moves with animal grace, stepping just beyond the flickering reach of light, and before the tape ends, he turns, for a single frame. His eyes are visible, not angry, not crazed, just curious, as if still learning, as if still deciding who deserves to be hunted next. It had been built at the farthest edge of the oldest road in town, nestled beneath crooked oaks and tangled ivy. half swallowed by time itself. The house had stood there longer than any of the paved streets or blinking lampposts, and long after its final owner had vanished, it had continued to endure, its foundation sinking slowly into the earth, its walls groaning in the wind like a beast left to rot. No one had lived inside for nearly 4 decades. Some said it had belonged to a seamstress who vanished without a trace. Others whispered of a family that had moved in and never moved out. Whatever the truth, the house had grown into legend, avoided by all but the most foolish. On the last full moon of October, it had been approached once more. The arrival had been quiet. No engine had been heard. No footsteps echoed in the yard. And yet, 5 figures had crossed the crumbling threshold, one by one, swallowed by the doorframe and forgotten by the wind. At the head of the group had walked Evelyn, curious, restless, drawn to forgotten places like a moth to a dying flame. Behind her had trailed Theo, Marcus, and 2 others whose names the house would never remember. They had come with laughter, flashlights, and just enough fear to make it thrilling. The air inside had tasted old, thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. The house had sighed beneath their weight. Every floorboard had spoken. Every breath had echoed. Cobwebs had clung to their sleeves like fingers, and the walls had seemed too narrow, as though they had grown closer since the last human visit. No animals had stirred. No insects had moved. Even the dust had hung motionless, suspended as if the air itself had refused to shift. Still they had continued forward, down the main hallway, past faded wallpaper and rusting picture frames, toward a corridor where light did not reach. At the end of that corridor, a door had stood slightly ajar. None of them had noticed that the dust stopped there. No footprints had marked the space beyond. The room beyond the door had not matched the rest of the house. Inside, the walls had gleamed faintly beneath the flickering light of their torches, clean, intact, untouched. A faint floral pattern had curled across the wallpaper, pristine despite the surrounding decay. The air had grown cold, too cold for the season, too cold for breath not to fog. At the far end of the room, an antique mirror had stood, taller than any of them, framed in black wood, carved with vines and leaves that no longer grew. Its glass had been smooth and clear, without a single crack or smudge. Not one of them had questioned it. Not at first. They had stepped inside. The door had closed behind them. No sound had been heard. No hand had turned the knob, and yet the door had sealed them in. It had begun slowly. At first, only Evelyn had noticed the silence, too deep, too sharp. The others had laughed. Their voices had bounced back at them in strange ways, distorted, delayed, as if the walls themselves had not remembered how to echo. Then Marcus had seen it. The mirror, its reflection had been wrong, not obviously, not grotesquely. It had shown them, each of them, standing in the room, and yet something had not matched. A hand raised too slowly, a head turned just slightly too late, a blink delayed, a smile that did not belong. Theo had laughed again, unsure. Evelyn had not. She had stepped forward, and the closer she had moved, the more wrong the reflection had become. Her own face had stared back at her, wide-eyed, pale, but the eyes had not blinked. The mouth had twitched, the corners had pulled upward, and then it had smiled. The glass had not rippled. There had been no crack or sound, but Evelyn had felt it. The breath had left her body. The air had thinned. Something had shifted, not in the room, but in her. The cold had deepened. Her arms had refused to move, and the reflection had stepped forward. It had not needed to mimic. It had moved first, and she had followed. The others had not screamed. They had not run. They had remained frozen, whether by fear or something deeper. None had turned away. The glass had darkened. The room had grown silent once more, and Evelyn had vanished. By morning, only 4 had left the house. The town had barely noticed. The house had returned to its stillness, and the mirror had waited. In the days that followed, the 4 who had left the house carried with them a silence that had not belonged to them before. It had clung to their backs like a shadow, felt more than seen, heavy and present, especially near mirrors. They had not spoken much after that night, not to each other, not to anyone else. What words could be used to explain something so hollow and cold? They had each begun to sleep less. Lights had been kept on, curtains drawn, but every surface that could reflect, every mirror, every window, every polished screen, had started to shift when watched too closely. In the corners of their eyes, movement had been sensed, just barely, just enough. Then one by one, the others had disappeared. The first to go had been Theo. His dorm room had been found undisturbed. Lights still on, coffee still warm. The mirror above the sink had been shattered from the inside. Only one footprint had been found, bare, wet, and facing the glass. Marcus had gone next. He had been seen walking alone toward the edge of campus, away from the lights, toward the forested path that led nowhere. His phone had been found days later, lying in a patch of moss beneath an old bridge. Photos had been left open, dozens of them. Each one had shown his reflection, but only the reflection. In each image his face had been pressed against the glass, mouth open, eyes wide, screaming soundlessly from behind. The police had not understood. They had not seen the pattern. Back in the town, the old house had remained still. No boards had been nailed across its windows. No locks had been placed on the doors. No warnings had been posted, because no one had gone looking. Not for Evelyn, not for Theo, not for Marcus. Only Natalie had remained, and Natalie had begun to see the change. It had started with the mirrors. Every one of them had been covered, but reflections had found new homes. In the glare of her laptop screen, in the black surface of her phone, in the glint of water on her bathroom floor. Each time she had blinked, something had shifted. A shadow too near, a face in the background, a smile that wasn't hers. Natalie had stopped sleeping altogether. She had begun to hear breathing, not outside, not through walls, inside the mirror. It had come at night, usually just before dawn, slow and steady, wet and hollow, and then the tapping had begun. A finger, 1, then 2, then 5, pressed gently against the other side of the glass. It had never moved while she watched, but her reflection had changed, not all at once, not obviously, but piece by piece. First the eyes slightly duller, slightly too wide, then the smile, visible even when her own lips hadn't moved, then the gestures too smooth, too late, too wrong. One night, the mirror had fogged over by itself. No steam, no shower, just fog. A single sentence had appeared in the condensation, written from the inside. Natalie had screamed. She had thrown the mirror to the ground. It had not broken. It had only smiled back. By the time she returned to the house, it had already been too late. The door had opened for her. The hallway had breathed her name, and the room at the end had waited with open arms. The house had not changed. Its timbers still groaned with the weight of forgotten names. Its windows still filtered moonlight like dust through a sieve. But inside the silence had grown deeper, thicker, as though the walls had been fed. Natalie had entered with a slow step, not brave, resigned. The door had closed behind her without a sound. She had not flinched. The hallway had stretched long before her, longer than she remembered, as if the house had shifted to fit her return. Every step she took had been absorbed by the floor, the boards giving no echo, no protest. Her flashlight had flickered. Once, then again, then it had gone out, and the darkness had welcomed her. The room had still waited at the end of the corridor. Its door had remained slightly ajar, as if surprised by her return. Inside, the air had been colder than memory. No dust had rested on the shelves. No age had touched the wallpaper, and the mirror had remained exactly where it had always been. Perfect, clean and still. Natalie had stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air had pressed inward like water swallowing a diver. Her breath had fogged in front of her. Her heart had slowed, and then the mirror had awakened. Her reflection had not greeted her. There had been no movement, no mimicry, only emptiness. The mirror had shown the room but not her. She had stood there alone, but the glass had remained undisturbed, as though the mirror had denied her existence. And then the surface had rippled, from the center outward, like a drop of blood falling into still water. A shape had begun to form, soft at first, then sharper. A face, but not hers. Not exactly. The features had been familiar, but twisted. The eyes too large, the skin too pale. The mouth, a grin carved into porcelain. And then behind that face, others. Marcus, Theo, Evelyn, but not as they had been. Smiling, always smiling, their mouths wide, their teeth small and glassy, like fish bones. Their hands had pressed against the inside of the mirror. Skin translucent, veins like hairline, cracks beneath a polished surface. The mirror had no depth, and yet they had floated inside it. Natalie had turned to run, but the door had disappeared. The room had vanished. Only the mirror had remained. It had expanded, stretched, swallowed the ceiling, the floor, the walls. There had been no frame now, only reflection. And then she had been pulled forward. No hand had grabbed her. No force had shoved her. Her own feet had moved, drawn by the sound of faint laughter, drawn by her own voice, calling from the other side. She had reached the mirror. Her fingers had touched the surface. It had been warm, and then the reflection had blinked. Not her, the other. The glass had liquefied. Her hand had passed through, and Natalie had followed. The mirror had not shattered. It had not cracked or screamed. It had simply absorbed her. Quietly, completely, the room had returned to stillness, as it always did. The house had breathed in, then slowly out, settling into its ancient bones once more. Natalie had vanished without trace. No footprints, no blood, no sound. Only the mirror remained, gleaming softly in the dark, as if nothing had ever changed. Days passed, then weeks. Outside, the world moved on. Rain fell, leaves died. Snow came and covered the roads that led to the forgotten house. No search parties had returned. No one had spoken of Natalie, not out loud, and yet her image had remained. In mirrors, in reflections, in every surface, polished enough to reveal more than just what stood before it. People who had once known her, barely vaguely, began to see flickers in store windows, in puddles, in black phone screens as they dimmed, a shadow behind their own, a flash of pale skin and wide eyes, a mouth too still to speak, yet begging to be noticed. Then the sightings began. Those who had passed by the old house reported lights flickering behind its glassless windows, sounds like laughter, like footsteps, like weeping. Sometimes the door would be found open, even when no one had approached it for weeks, and sometimes those who dared to get too close spoke of a reflection in the mirror at the end of the hall, not their own, someone else's, waiting, Inside that mirror, they say a collection has grown, faces pressed against the silver surface, always smiling, trapped not as they were but as the house had remembered them, young, frightened, beautifully broken, each expression preserved in stillness, watching the world pass by without them. Some scream behind the glass, some pound the invisible wall, but none ever return. They say the mirror feeds, not on flesh, but on memory, on fear, on guilt. It takes what you see when you close your eyes and turns it against you. It twists the familiar into something cruel and patient. It waits until the moment you look too long and dares you to blink. The house is still there. No locks, no warnings, no fence. The door creaks open if you get close enough. And in the back room, under the papered walls and still air, the mirror waits, impossibly clean, unaging, watching, always watching.